Uh, Thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Brad Hazlett, Director of Sales with Inquest and founder of the CISO Network. We have a special guest today, the CTO of Inquest, Pedro Mamini, and this will be a great presentation and looking forward to your feedback. So Pedro, if you'd like to start, that'd be great.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. Appreciate the introduction and appreciate folks taking time to basically get a sneak peek at an experiment that we've been working on. We call it the Trystero project. I can't take credit for the name. One of my colleagues came up with this reference. It's actually from a novel written in 1965 called The Crying of Lot 49. And this symbol is some kind of emblem of like this secret postal society. We thought it was neat. And so that's the name of the project. The intent of the project is, our company DNA comes from on-premise carrier class, high throughput network appliances. As we look to expand into the enterprise and are looking at cloud, looking at the SaaS space, we were invented as a gap filler. Essentially, we looked at the problem space that other people were not solving. And so we solved that problem on premise. We're looking for similar types of problems in the cloud space. And so we thought, let's start with the default email providers, all right? The three big ones, Microsoft, that's O365, the G Suite from Google, and Amazon, probably the lesser known of the three, provides a simple email service and a work mail service. They're the third one that we're looking at. Maybe some quick background info on myself. I'm a New York City native. I live in Austin, Texas now. I got into offensive security in the late 90s when I was in high school. I'm self-taught. I learned how to do reverse engineering with soft ice, and I started playing with phone systems, phone phreaking, red boxing. My professional career started in 2002 with a company called iDefense. I was hired there to essentially run their vulnerability contributor program. This was the first public domain vulnerability brokerage house. Folks would submit their vulnerability knowledge to us. We'd validate it. We'd make an offer to buy the IP from them, and then we contact the vendor and disclose it responsibly. That company was bought by VeriSign, and that's when I moved down to Austin to start a similar program called the Zero Day Initiative under Tipping Point. And to date, that's the biggest program of this kind. I consider this to be my unfair advantage. Where I've gotten to work with countless researchers, and I've seen thousands of zero day. I've done a bunch of open source work. I've published a book on fuzzing. Sully's a fuzzing framework. PyMaze a reverse engineering framework, and OpenRCE, a now archived community for reverse engineers. And then from there, I've gone mostly into a defensive. I did a consumer product called JumpShot. That was an out-of-band automated malware removal tool for like rootkits and bootkits, the kind of deeply entrenched malware that your runtime AV would have problems dealing with. And since 2014, I've been focused on Inquest. We are essentially a threat hunting, threat intelligence solution. We do automation. We work at scale. One of our biggest research projects really is, let's ingest malware at scale and then discover which ones of those are novel. All right, there's millions of new samples found a day, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. How do we focus our attention on the interesting ones? What are the interesting ones? So for today, first we're going to, why email security and why email security assessment? To draw an analogy to, who was it? It was Willie Sutton, the bank robber, when he was asked by a reporter, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Similarly, this is where the problem is. If you look at the Verizon data breach report, 30% of compromise is phishing, 95% is somewhere over email. The vast bulk of attacks are originating in email. So that's why we're looking at that and focusing at that. And then from there, our idea is, well, let's take a bunch of real world malware and let's throw it at the various providers. Let's see what comes through. And then let's kind of have a report card for each to get an idea for where their defensive posture is best. And that leads to the question of, well, where do we harvest a corpus? Once we've done that, how are we going to sift through the noise? We can't be sending millions of files a day through these providers. Then of course, how do the providers compare? And finally, what I've labeled the easy button here, we've essentially created somewhat of an automation like we can opt folks into to test their own email security stack, whatever their provider is and whatever additional security controls they have on top of it. Essentially, they can just become part of the experiment. And I'll dive more into that later. Maybe it's just a quick recap of what are we even talking about here. Let's look at what a common malware campaign looks like, what the common components are. Whether it's you're a traditional company with like an ingress, egress, network perimeter, or a more modern, fuzzy, software-defined, SASE type company, as we mentioned, the vast majority of attacks are going to come over email. So that's the first place as a defender, we might be able to stop the chain of attack, is detecting that carrier, be it a malicious link, or maybe more commonly a malicious attachment, like a PDF file that may have a phishing lure embedded in it, an Office document that might have an exploit in it, or perhaps an Office document that has a macro that's just coercing the user into activating the embedded payload. Whatever the choice of the operator is, that's our first line of defenses. Can we stop that email from being delivered? Once that initial carrier has taken effect, has been activated on the target system, generally you'll see multiple pivots from there. This is just one example. There's infinite ways that this can be done. But as an example, you might see a PowerShell execution that then goes and talks to a compromised WordPress site and downloads its next stage payload. Detections on the patterns that are used in the HTTP request, that becomes another potential anchor for defenders to stop this attack. Maybe you missed the carrier on the way in, you can potentially stop its communication trying to pull down the next stage payload. Assuming that fails and assuming there's not a pivot, perhaps there is an additional download from some hosted AWS server. Right, this is infrastructure that the operator has stood up. They own this one versus the previous one, which they've taken over. They've pwned a vulnerable website. And again, for pretty common things here, indicators like domains, IP addresses, a little bit fancier with SSL certificate hashes. Again, we might be able to now anchor on the infrastructure and again, stop this attack chain. Because at any point, if we stop the attack chain, we've stopped the infection from being successful. And then finally, at some point, there's a final payload that's being downloaded to do whatever it's going to do, whether it's ransomware or something more nefarious. Again, that gives us another opportunity as defenders to block that payload. But we focus our efforts on number one. Everything else is, of course, defense in depth. You want to do it across the board. That's where we're focusing our efforts. That's where this email provider comparison comes into play. So looking at the corpus, there's myriad of ways you can harvest a corpus. In our particular case, we're going to harvest from the ubiquitous Virus Total Intelligence service. This is brought to you by Google. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's basically a combination of over 70 different endpoint vendors, detection engines, in a crowdsourced SaaS platform for passing industry-wide judgment on files. 40 out of 70 vendors thought this file was malicious. 0 out of 65 vendors thought this file was malicious. These are the kinds of things you get from it. It's ubiquitous among InfoSec vendors. I can't think of a single defender that doesn't have a subscription. And because of that, it's also a source of a massive echo chamber. As you'll see in a little bit, we kind of accommodate for that. When a false positive appears in VirusTotal based off a new file that was uploaded, you'll kind of see that percolate to the other vendors before folks figure it out, and then it cools off. So the verdicts change over time on initial analysis versus analyzed 10 days later. Hindsight's 2020. Folks do data sharing, signatures are being updated, so you can expect a low detection sample today in a couple weeks time for those verdicts to settle, and it's very well detected. Of equal importance and worth mentioning is that it's also ubiquitous among malware operators. This may sound counterintuitive. Why on earth would a malware operator throw their Whereas against a system where it's known that every security vendor on the planet has access to that data feed. At the end of the day, it's valuable for them. This is what they use to test to see if they could bypass basic defenses. And if we're smart enough and clever enough, we can potentially capture some of these even zero-day operations by harvesting this corpus of data from VirusTotal. We gave a talk in 2019 at Black Hat, which entirely focused around the subject matter. The name of it is called Worm Charming. We link it from our blog. You can easily find it. But there was 3 particular CVEs that we targeted, that we proved essentially you could have gotten early warning on those CVEs from the VirusTotal feed well before those campaigns were actually released in the wild. So as opposed to being reactive to a zero-day being exploited in the wild, it's very plausible to have detected that and proactively seen those payloads. If we're looking at VirusTotal intelligence statistically, looking at their daily uploads, and I just pulled these stats, you can see that blue line across the top is the number of total files that were uploaded on November 10th. Red line below it is how many of those were distinct. So we went from about 1.8 million to about 1.6 million. That means 200,000 files were uploaded more than once. The next line, the green one, is 1.4 million new. That means they were never seen before. So this is the first time ever that it was uploaded to the service. And the final orange line is 900,000 distinct new files that were detected as malicious by one or more engines. So we're talking about 900,000 new files a day that are detected as malicious, and who knows how many that bypass detection. That's the reason why folks are leveraging this service to test their malware. This is a massive amount of data, right? This is not something that we can go through. It'd be a tremendous amount of money to sandbox such a thing. Forget about it in terms of manual analysis. So something has to be done for us to reduce this corpus size. There's too much in here. But how do we find the signal? How do we sift out the best of the best? So to do this, and this is a synopsis, we've open sourced the rules that do this. We talk about in detail the science behind this in that Black Hat talk I referenced. But in a nutshell, we're looking for things that we know are typical of novel malware campaigns. They layer their carriers. So like a Matryoshka doll, you might have an RTF inside a document, inside a zip file. There will be some offensive characteristics, but it may not have high AV detection. Right? We're looking for things that are definitely malware, but not run of the mill, not garden variety. Things that are more on the bleeding edge, have a higher chance of being active campaigns are going to bypass the default provider stacks. Because this isn't a small challenge. Both Microsoft and Google have thrown an enormous amount of resources into this problem. And let's not forget that Google owns VirusTotal. So that in itself is a question. Like how much do they, if we're harvesting the data from Google, perhaps we're giving them an unfair advantage since they have access to the corpus. It's something to think about as we're going through this process. We also do clustering. This is a machine learning approach in order to reduce the volume. And in the end, what we're doing is we're reducing it from about 1 million. It comes out to be in the max amount between 2 and 3 million files. We get it down to between 5 and 10,000 samples a day. So well under 1% of the overall corpus. This graph you're seeing on the bottom, it's a little bit hard to read, but the upper bound here is 5K. Each of these colored bands represent one of those open source hunt rules. The results of that, of course, are not guaranteed to be malicious. This is just the net that we're casting to pull in a vast amount of data. The next thing that we do with this data is we feed it through, basically this large apparatus that we've built. It's responsible for dissecting all these files with, our static analysis engine called Deep File Inspection. That gives us a way to, do our regular hunting that we do for customers. We can now do it on this kind of data at scale, just using all our own, commercial tools. We're pulling data in from a number of different public sources, aggregate reputation feeds, indicators that come from blogs, Twitter handles, GitHub pages that we're watching. This component called Threat Ingester on the left there is an open source component that we've written. You can find it on our GitHub, github.com/inquest. ThreatKB is another open source tool, although that's in alpha state. And then the rest of this mechanism that you're seeing, if you're curious to dive deeper into it, I recommend you check out that Black Hat talk. But basically the goal is ingest the file, dissect it, determine whether or not it may be interesting, queue it up for a +10 and a +20 day scan to determine if it was actually malicious in hindsight. Right, we're going to leverage the verdicts kind of settling in the entire AV industry by waiting for 10 days, let people catch up, kind of take a measurement, and then wait 20 days, again, take another measurement and pass some decision making on that. Now the purpose of this apparatus was to find novel, interesting malware automatically, and we're doing this now daily. In fact, it's gotten so good that we've actually connected it to our Slack. So we've got a bunch of experiments that run, and they, through real-time chat notifications, will send us notices, and we even have some automations that connect this apparatus directly to social media. So for example, here are some automated tweets we sent recently. And what we're doing here is, from this corpus, we found a document. That document references another document. So the original document itself is seemingly benign. You have to actually go and fetch the secondary payload. And then that secondary payload was indeed malicious. And furthermore, the infrastructure on which that payload was hosted has not been discussed, nor has it been reported. So we're cross-referencing the indicator against our own reputation and indicator aggregation. Assuming all that is true, we found something that's novel and interesting, let's tweet about it, right? And this happens, maybe maximum once a day, couple times a day max. Another experiment we have is connecting what we're calling this experiment as the IOC skimmer, right? So these are malicious documents that contain a URL indicator that seems, based on a number of heuristics, to definitely be malicious. Again, if a variety of different checks pass and the indicator hasn't been talked about, nor has it been reported, nor have we tweeted or posted on Reddit about it in the past, we'll automatically post it to a channel. So the confidence in which some of these experiments are producing interesting results, it's very high fidelity. Now coming back to the experiment we're talking about, the mail provider comparison, we essentially attach the output of the file feed that you saw in that apparatus, for lack of a better term, into what we call the mail provider comparison, this Trystero project. So what we're doing is we're taking the ones that we find are interesting, and then we are sending them via email attachment through a G Suite address that we control, through an Outlook.com address, through an O365 tenant with ATP enabled, through an O365 tenant with ATP enabled, and with advanced phishing protection. Assuming that a file is able to bypass all four of these, then that file is considered part of our daily harvest for this Trystero. We use that for our automated breach and attack simulation. So if I were to hook up a email address to this output, you're essentially getting, and the volume here is going to be some days nothing, other days a handful. The max we've seen is like a dozen or 2 dozen per day that are capable of bypassing all of them. Numbers that are capable of bypassing any one are much higher, but we want to find the stealthiest of the malware because we assume that most folks probably have some additional controls on top of what the mail providers provide. And so we want to have the best of the best. Now, in this particular comparison, I'll show Google versus Microsoft. I have Amazon ghosted out here. We're going to be, I'll talk about this later, but we're essentially going to be doing a monthly report on this starting in 2021, and Amazon will be part of that. But at this stage, kind of a sneak peek into what we're looking at. Let's just zoom in on Google versus Microsoft, and we'll look at actually a recent week. So from November 1st to November 8th, Sunday to Sunday. The graphs we're showing here are number of samples sent versus blocked per day. Green is sent, red is blocked. Top left is G Suite, top right is Outlook.com, bottom left is O365 ATP, bottom right is the ATP plus the advanced phishing detection. And you can see, from this scale, the upper limits here are looks like 8,000, 9,000. The lines look fairly tight over time, with the exception of Outlook. Outlook, I can tell you right now, between these different providers, it's by far and consistently the furthest behind. If you're setting up a free email address, I highly recommend you go with the G Suite over in Outlook.com. You will get undoubtedly better protection. Now, if we look at the number of samples that bypass the provider security, and in this case, we're only looking at, we dropped Outlook.com, just Google versus Microsoft, G Suite versus ATP, really. We can see they kind of follow a similar trend, right? Where they miss more together, they catch more together as time goes on. So just looking at this first juncture, this was a case where on November 3rd, 245 samples bypassed all three of the default providers here. Right? So they were even. At this moment, ATP plus phishing was able to, I'm sorry, what is this? Is this bypassed or blocked? No, these are bypassed. So in this particular case, it's backwards, which is, it seems logically backwards. So ATP plus phishing allowed 69 to get through. Just ATP allowed 51, and G Suite by itself was able to, only 46 samples bypassed it. Looking at November 6th, again, G Suite in this case is the winner. It only had 35 that allowed to bypass, and here it makes more sense, right? ATP plus phishing has less bypasses than just ATP. It's interesting to note that nuance. Now, if we tally it all up, sent versus blocked to each one of these, we get these numbers here. So we across the board during that time frame, almost 28,000 emails were sent with various attachments, and the numbers on the side are how many were blocked. If we were to give them a ranking for this week, number one actually turns out to be 0365 with plus is ATP plus phishing. Number two is G Suite, and then number three is just 0365 with ATP. In terms of like efficacy rate, it changes week over week. In this particular week, we're looking at Outlook had about 60%, and then it was pretty close between 0365 Google and 0365 the phishing. It was 98, 98.1, and 98.2. All around, actually not half bad this week. And I say this week because it changes week over week. The best average I'd say is between 85 and 95% coverage is what you'll see from the default providers. In the worst case, I've seen days where across the board, there was 40%. And some of that, of course, is based on what data we have coming in. A new malware campaign comes out, they might release a ton of it's a new tactic that's hard to detect, and they just had a huge volume. So of course you got to take those numbers with a grain of salt. So what does that mean? Is Microsoft the best? Right. And actually, and forget about the over time, just looking at it from this snapshot, this week's snapshot. Well, let's look at the kinds of things that it blocked. All right. If we look at the defense breakdown between the three columns, so Google, ATP plus phish, I forgot the plus phish in the slide. If we look at the types of threats that they're blocking, it breaks down into these different file types, Adobe PDF, portable executable file formats, XML, JS is JavaScript, CAB is cabinet files, that's compressed archive format. Office is your suite of like Excel, PowerPoint, Office documents, and then you got Java applets. So Google blocks the most variants, right? If we look at, and knowing that the third column is ATP plus phish, the second is just ATP, and that Google has seemingly the most varied coverage, we can very, very roughly draw the conclusion that the file types highlighted here lean towards phishing, right? If we assume that all these guys are fairly decent at catching the same kinds of threats, then the ones that stand out for the phishing side in Adobe, these file types are phishing file types. And I can tell you from empirically, this is correct. It's pretty common for Office documents to be armed with malware, and for phishing PDF, XML, and JS to be used as a phishing kind of intermediaries. If we look at the ones that are then only covered by Microsoft ATP, then we can deduce that these are probably lend to themselves more towards malware. And this is also empirically correct, right? Executables are not going to be used for phishing. They're going to contain malware. So what's left actually is the gap that Google's covering that nobody else is. So from an attacker's perspective, if I'm looking to target an O365 user, I'm probably going to go at them with a Java applet, right? That's something that seems to be just generically a gap that Microsoft has. So even though numerically, O365 with ATP plus phishing did the best, looking at it this way in terms of like the spread of kinds of badness that they can block, Google seems to have done better. So who's the best then? Right? And the answer is no one. The one thing that is clear is that augmentation is requisite, right? Even 95% is not an efficacy rate that you should be comfortable with. If you're legitimately doing a defense at depth, you want to start off, with a strong foot forward and get into the deep nines of blocking there. And we'd expect to see 99+% of blocking at the email level. We expected Google to be the clear winner. I mentioned earlier that because they have access to, obviously we're sourcing the files from a service they run, it seems that perhaps they would have an unfair advantage there. And so we did some things like munging of the hashes to ensure that there was no difference. They weren't hashing and caching. And to the best of our ability to measure it, they're not leaning on those AV verdicts, right? Quite honorable of Google. They have that there, but they're not using it. Whether it's a perk or a con, however you want to look at it, it does not seem to be used for blocking threats that are going through G Suite. Another assumption is we expected some relative consistency with the efficacy. Right? If Google is going to be the winner 1 week, it should be like that week over week, and it isn't. Right? Every month it's different. It's up and down. The providers are going back and forth, and that makes it fun from an experiment point of view, and it gives us something to publish on a regular basis as well. We're going to loop Amazon into the comparison soon. We have it flowing, but don't have actual strong results analyzed for it yet. And we expect to start publishing a monthly, maybe a blog or some kind of thing in our newsletter in January on here's the kinds of threats here's who did better than who this month. Here's the kind of threats that ate everyone's lunch. Here's the kind of threats per provider that you really would have benefited from having some other augmentation around it. And on a final note is, what I call the easy button, right? We've taken this entire apparatus and we've made it quite easy to test anybody's security stack, right? This is an automated assessment of your email security stack and all the bells and whistles you have turned on against a daily curation of real world malware that we found capable of bypassing the default provider. So we know that this malware can get by your core fabric there. Let's see if the additional controls you have on top of it can stop it. You'll receive regular reports on the evasive threat kinds, like it was this types of formats with these kind of threats. It was macro versus exploit. It was phishing in PDF versus Java, and just malware, in the attachment. Additionally, because we have AV verdicts for a lot of these, and it's not just AV, it's endpoint as well, right? Detection verdicts, vendor verdicts. We can actually give some guidance on, hey, here's some endpoint products that would have best covered the gap. These specific sample kinds that got through. Here are the ones, if you would have had this AV engine, it would have been the best bang for your buck because it would have blocked 80% of the ones that did get through. So that's another perk to kind of getting this loop established for your own domain. If we're distilling it down into a single visual, what we're doing here is we're taking millions of files, chopping it up every step of the way, funneling and sifting until we have a final deliverable, a daily harvest of breach and attack simulation. And then we email these into and out of your environment into an account that you create and we joint, collaborate on. Kind of visualizing this, there's no GDPR concerns here. There's no access to email or forwarding, default mail routes. This is a simple security controls check. You would create inquest at yourdomain.com and set up a forwarding rule so that any emails it received from prospect at inquestsecurity.net would just forward right back to it. So we're just pumping out emails. We expect those emails to be forwarded back. If they are, we know that it bypassed your ingress egress stack. If not, thumbs up. We know that you blocked it. At the end of the day, we get to tabulate the results and provide a regular report. So that pretty much wraps it up. Really appreciate everyone's time. Kind of taking a sneak peek at one of our larger scale experiments that we're running. I'd love to open up the floor for questions. And of course, feel free to contact us if you're curious to set up this free assessment. We'd love to hear about what your security stack is, and we can see how it compares against the default providers. You just email us, info@inquest.net. You can hit us up on Twitter via @Inquest, or if you're looking for me specifically, I can be found as @Pedamamini on any of these platforms. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time today. Thank you, Pedram, for the presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you.